Wind's really picking up out there, so I'm glad you have a warm, cozy place to listen to stories. Welcome to Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get started on our 5 great stories today. This next one was actually written by Panda Lee and co-written by me, so I hope you enjoy it. It's about a strange house that a couple find and fall in love with, though they fall in love with it for different reasons. So let me take you on a tour of Reality House. "Oh my God, there it is! Stop the car, Jacob!" Lily exclaimed as the house she saw in the ad came into view. Lily and Jacob had been in the same neighborhood for most of their 12-year marriage. They had liked the area when they moved in, but the peaceful neighborhood had seen its share of crime and decline lately. The straw that broke the camel's back and made them decide to move had been 3 nights ago when they'd been out to dinner. They'd been celebrating their 12-year anniversary when someone broke into their house and ransacked the place. Anything of value that wasn't locked in the safe was taken. When the police finally got there, they acted as though they couldn't care less. There was absolutely no help. So the next day, Lily went online to find a new house within their price range. Lo and behold, she found a lovely house a few neighborhoods over, on the nicer side of town. It was a closer commute to Jacob's work and was well within their price range. Lily wasted no time calling the number on the ad and setting up a walkthrough. They had set it up for that Saturday morning, but when Saturday arrived, Lily had gotten a short text telling her to go ahead and have a look at the place and sending her the code to the key box on the door. The owners said that they wouldn't be able to make it, but if they wanted to take a look, they could go right ahead, just to be sure to return the key when they were done and let them know what they thought. Jacob was very reluctant and wanted Lily to reschedule for a time when the owner could join them, but Lily wouldn't hear of it. She threatened to go herself, but that seemed to make up Jacob's mind, and he agreed to come with her. As they pulled into the driveway, Lily could hardly contain herself. She jumped out of the car and rushed to the porch, stretching her arms and taking a deep breath. The scent of gardenias filled her nose, the smell reminding her of summers she spent at her grandmother's house as a child. In fact, the front porch reminded her a little of her grandparents' house, too. The long porch stretched the whole front of the house, and it had several weather-worn rockers and a swing hanging from a pair of chains. Had her grandmother had a swing like that? Had Lily sat on it and swung when she was a little girl? Had she gone too high, perhaps? And Jacob leaned out the window, his hand over the phone. "Sweetheart, it's work. I gotta take this. I'll catch up with you as soon as I get done." Lily gave him a tart look and shrugged. She took one more deep breath before mounting the porch and approaching the front door. She had seen it on Zillow when she was looking for houses, and it had been one of the biggest reasons she wanted the place. It had 8 squares on the front. There was red, green, and green again, just like her grandparents' door. She could remember standing in front of the door as a little girl, feeling excited as she waited for it to open. Since her grandmother wasn't going to come to let her in this time, she put in the code and got the key to open the door. The door opened with a little creak, and Lily stepped inside with a broad grin. Jacob looked up at Lily as she walked into the house, thinking of how beautiful she looked as she walked past the threshold. He couldn't have known this, but it would be the last time he'd ever see her. As Lily stepped into the front hall of the house, she felt a bit of déjà vu. She felt like she was coming home, as if she'd been here 1,000 times before. On her right was a large archway that led into a sitting room. Lily decided to check out that room first, since it was the closest, and there was a window so she could look out and see if Jacob was coming in. As she walked into the room, she felt a strange change in the atmosphere, the whole thing beginning to shift. Lily walked to the window to call out to Jacob, but when she looked outside, his car was no longer in the driveway. Instead, there were several familiar-looking vehicles. Was that her parents' car from when she was 9? And that car looked like Aunt Judy's car. That truck parked on the street looked just like her grandparents'. But that was impossible. She'd watched her mom sell that car when she was 10. What was going on here? As she stood there confused, she heard a voice calling to her. Lily turned around, but she was no longer alone. Her family filled the couch and chairs. The room looked just like her grandma's sitting room from when she was a kid. She could remember seeing everyone seated like this once before, and the memory made her feel kind of crawly. As a child, they had often sat in her grandmother's sitting room during holidays or special occasions, but something was off today. Something wasn't quite how she remembered it. Everyone looked as though they had been crying. She didn't remember this scene from her childhood quite like this. Something was very wrong. As she abandoned her place next to the window, she walked as though in a haze to where her mother sat. She looked up as Lily approached and patted the couch next to her, motioning for her to sit. Her mother put an arm around her, not an altogether familiar feeling, and when Lily spoke, her voice was that of a very young child. "What's wrong, Mama?" Lily asked, looking around at everyone and seeing tears welling up in their eyes. Her father spoke first, though. "Lilybug, there's been an accident. Your grandmother fell down the basement stairs. She didn't make it." As those words left his mouth, everyone began to wail, and Lily felt her mother press her face against her head. Lily, however, sat speechless, trying to process what she'd heard. This wasn't how she remembered this. Was it? Lily got up from her spot on the couch and began to pace. Her memory of that day was fuzzy, but as she walked between the couch and the window, it began to solidify. She remembered her family telling her that her grandma had gone to live in Boca, not that she was dead. When Lily turned back to confront her mother, though, she found that she was alone in the sitting room again. The furniture, her family, everything was gone. The room was as it was when she walked through the front door, and Lily shuddered as a palpable chill ran through her. "Looks like a goose walked over your grave," she heard her grandmother say, and it was as if she were just in the next room. Lily rushed to the front door to get out of the house, wanting nothing so much as to smell the gardenias again, before she jumped into the car and told Jacob to drive away. She should have listened to him. She should have waited, but she'd been so eager to see this place. It had brought back so many memories, so many times that made her feel young again. But that was gone now. She didn't care how dangerous their neighborhood was. She would gladly live there for the rest of time if it meant that she could leave this mausoleum. The door, however, was gone. The entryway was still there, but the wall where the front door should be was a blank. She ran back to the sitting room window and started pounding on it, trying to get Jacob's attention. His car was back, and he was sitting in the front seat, but he didn't seem to hear her. "Jacob, please, help me!" she screamed, but Jacob didn't answer. He glanced up, but then looked back down to the phone, talking with Terry or Mark or whoever it was calling him from work. He couldn't see her. He didn't know she was stuck. And suddenly Lily realized she was alone. If she was going to get out of here, she'd have to do it herself. Lily thought she might as well look for another way out, and as if summoned, she noticed the hallway that ran opposite the sitting room. There would be a bathroom down there, if she remembered right, and some cold water on her face sounded exactly like what she needed. She headed to the bathroom, but as she got closer, she felt that strange shivering again. As she came closer, she could hear the sound of sloshing water, as if someone was splashing frantically in the bathtub. Lily stepped cautiously to the door that separated the hall from the small bathroom, and peeked in as the wooden barrier made a funny squeaking sound. She could see her father knelt down at the side of the tub, and she could see him holding her mother's head under the water. Lily stepped back, the door opening to give her a terrible view of her mother's drowning. But it all seemed wrong. That wasn't how she remembered that horrible time when she was 12. Was it? Lily remembered her father trying to help her mother out of the tub when she'd had a seizure. She remembered him trying, but not being able to save her. This new reality of what really happened hurt her brain more than her heart, and Lily tore off in a mad scramble to be away from the awful sound of her mother drowning again and again. Lily ran to the staircase that lay beyond the foyer and darted up the steps without thinking of where she was going. As she ran into one of the bedrooms, her mind still reeling from the scene below, the feeling of déjà vu came yet again. As she turned to take in the room that she had just run into, she could see a crib with a mobile twirling overhead. The smiling yellow ducks spun drunkenly, but even their placidity couldn't bring joy to the scene. This was her son's room. No, she pleaded, not this memory. Her husband walked into the room, holding their 3-week-old son to his chest. It should have brought her joy to see him again, till she realized her wonderful husband was holding little Jonathan's face to his chest, muffling the sound of his cries. He didn't seem to notice her watching him, didn't seem to care at all that he was snuffing the life from what would be their only child. After the baby had stopped crying, Jacob quietly kissed him on his little cheek and placed him in his crib. But no, that's not how it had gone at all. Lily's memory was fuzzy, but she remembered Jacob holding their baby and comforting him till he fell asleep. When she had woken up and noticed that Jonathan hadn't woken up for his feeding yet, she went to his room and found him cold and blue in his crib. She screamed for her husband, and Jacob had rushed to her side to find her cradling their poor baby as if she could bring him back to life. They called 911, but when the EMTs arrived, they said it was too late. His death was stated as SIDS, and the two had been left to mourn their loss. Lily didn't know how much more she could take in this house. She slid down the wall, crying as the crib vanished, and the room once again was empty. Lily sat there for a few minutes, getting her bearings. Then she got up and slowly walked down the stairs. She didn't want to see any more, but she knew that she had to get out of this house if she intended to have any sanity left when she escaped. As Jacob sat in the front seat, talking to his boss, he realized that Lily hadn't come out of the house yet. It had been at least an hour since he'd told her he'd catch up with her, and she should have been able to see the whole place twice in an hour. He looked up at the window that overlooked the front yard, hoping to see her looking out at him, but no such luck. "Listen, Mark, we can handle the rest of this on Monday. I need to check on Lily. She's alone in the house we're both supposed to be looking at, and I'm getting a little worried about her." "Okay, that's fine. See you Monday. Bye." As Jacob climbed out of the car and walked towards the porch, he could smell a familiar smell. He stopped in the walkway and took a deep whiff, savoring the scent he hadn't smelled in years. It was bourbon and cigar smoke, and it reminded him of the Saturday night poker games at his dad's house. Dad's poker games had been full of both, and Jacob remembered peeking in as a kid so he could watch the festivities. As he got to the door and tried to open it to join his wife, the door was locked. He knocked, wondering why she had locked it behind herself if she wanted him to come take a look. "Lily, let me in, sweetheart. I'm sorry it took so long, but you know how much of a windbag Mark can be." But Lily didn't respond. He knocked a little louder, but still no response. At this point, Jacob began to worry that something had happened to her. He pounded on the door, his fears coming back at the thought of what could be happening to his wife. Hadn't he thought this sounded like a great way to get robbed or kidnapped? He didn't know this guy from Adam, and he had just let his wife go in alone. What had he been thinking? "Lily!" he yelled as he beat on the door, but no answer came. Lily walked down the steps and into the basement as if in a trance. She was numb from the torture that this house had put her through, and just wanted to be outside in the sun again before it could show her anything else. As she descended the basement stairs, the air shifted again, and she steadied herself for what was next. She opened her eyes to see that she was in her own basement, but something was off. The shelves where she kept the Christmas ornaments were pushed away from the wall. As she walked over to see why it was pulled away, she saw a trap door under where the shelf usually was. The door was open, and Lily could hear something down there. Whatever it was crying out softly, as though too weak to scream. Jacob, worried and a little angry, decided to try to find another way in. He walked around to the back of the house, but as he came to the gate, he too felt that overpowering sense of déjà vu. When he got to the backyard, he saw a swing set that looked lonely in the open space. It looked like his own swing set from when he was a kid, and he walked curiously towards it. When he reached the swing, Jacob sat down and looked at the back door. He realized it was his childhood door, and scrunched up his eyes as he tried to make sense of it. He'd spent a lot of time on his swing while his dad talked with his mom. As he watched the window by the door, Jacob saw people inside talking loudly, their silhouettes performing sad little plays for this child's eyes to watch. But this isn't how he remembered this happening. It had been just another fight, his dad starting it like always. The mailman had been sitting at their kitchen table when he came home, a cold towel on his head, as he drank a glass of his mom's lemonade. He had nearly collapsed on the front lawn in the heat, and though his father had smiled when he saw the man cooling off in his kitchen, Jacob had seen his mother flinch when he looked at her. His father had waited till after dinner to tell his son to go play out back while they talked, and his mother had seemed to beg him with her eyes not to leave. Jacob watched as his dad reached for something on the counter, and his mom's silhouette backed away slowly. His dad lunged with a sudden rage, and Jacob imagined he could hear the frying pan connect with the side of her head. His dad's dark afterimage stood over her for a few minutes, the pan coming down a few more times until sanity seemed to reassert itself. He stood up, the image realizing that it had talked a little too vigorously this time. Jacob could almost see the lack of confidence in the outline as it weighed its options. When it looked out at him, Jacob realized his father meant to make him an accomplice to his folly. "Jacob," his father yelled from the doorway, "get me a shovel from the shed. Then I need you to get in the truck and wait for me." Jacob hopped dutifully off the swing, with much smaller feet than his own. He was horrified at his blind fanaticism, but understood it all too well. As he ran to the shed to fetch the shovel, he realized that the memory of the night his mother left him wasn't the way he remembered it. Dad wasn't planting a garden to surprise her with, and Mom hadn't left them for a fella who ran the register at Ralph's. He did what he was told, though, and grabbed the shovel. He gave it to his dad and ran to the truck as his father began grunting at something that must have been very heavy in the kitchen. It couldn't have been his mother. Jacob's mom ate like a bird. Surely he wouldn't have strained so much to lift her. As soon as Jacob got in the truck, everything became hazy again. He realized he was back in his own car, his father's truck gone. As Jacob sat there, he began to cry. He didn't want to cry. He hadn't cried in so long, but found the tears just wouldn't stop. He was terrified of what had just happened. He was scared of a man he had buried 10 years ago. He was grieving for his mother in a way that he had never managed to when he was 8. Above all else, Jacob was worried about his wife. "Hello?" Lily whispered as she descended the stairs. "Who's down there? Do you need help?" She whispered, understanding the irony of her question a little too late. As she spoke, the whimpering stopped. It was dark and damp down here, the floor made of packed earth, and the smell of dirt and iron filled her nose. As she felt around for a light switch, she could hear something shifting across the room. Lily paused for a second, trying to listen to what it was. It was hard to hear over the sound of her heart beating in her ears, and Lily was afraid of getting snuck up on down here by the specters in the house again. She found a small chain hanging from a bulb in the ceiling. As she pulled it, the small light lit the room pathetically, but what she saw still terrified her. This was not any memory that she had ever had. She looked to where the sound was coming from and found herself staring back at her from a dirty mattress on the floor. She was battered and beaten, starved, with one hand attached to the wall by a metal cuff. Lily, in shock, started to back away, but heard someone walking into the basement. She quickly turned off the light and backed up against the wall, praying the darkness would hide her. As the steps got closer, Lily felt around for something to defend herself with in case the person came downstairs. As she slid her hand across the cold dirt floor, she found what felt like a pipe and picked it up as quickly as possible, holding it to her chest. A few moments later, she could hear heavy footsteps coming down the cellar stairs. She closed her eyes and prayed she wouldn't be seen. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the cellar. She was standing in front of the front door. Jacob got himself together and returned to the backyard to find a way in. The swing set was gone, as was the shed. The back door was no longer his childhood back door either. This door was white, with a blue ruffle at the top of the window, and the realization made him feel a little bit better. He pushed up the 3 steps to the door and turned the knob. The door opened easily, and as he walked over the threshold into the kitchen, he felt the shift again. He was in his dad's kitchen, and his father was talking to the police officer. "Mr. Daniels, do you know of anywhere your ex-wife would have gone?" the officer asked, tapping his pencil on an ancient-looking notebook. "No, officer. Like I've told you before, she called me 3 weeks ago asking to pick up our son because she needed a break from him. He can be a handful, so I agreed and went over to get my boy. She didn't tell me where she was going or when she'd come back. Jacob, go on to your room now and play. Let me and these officers finish our conversation." He had been 9 when the officers came to question his father. Jacob knew better than to disagree with the old man, but he knew that his mother had made no such request. At the time, it had seemed that maybe Daddy had been confused, but Jacob found out later that his mother had divorced him and left town with someone else. She had never tried to see Jacob again, and his father telling the police a lie had always seemed a little weird to him. One look at his father's flinty eyes, however, had told him to do as he was told, and Jacob ran for the staircase in the living room. He was walking towards the doorway when he looked back towards his father, only to find that everything was gone. The kitchen was empty now, save for him. Lily reached for the handle of the door, turning the knob with trepidation. Was this another trick? Some new game for the house to tease her with? She had never given up hope that she would get out, but she thought she might have believed the house would keep her here forever anyway. Would they even find her body, she wondered? Would they know it was her if they did? The door swung open, and Lily was again assaulted by the smell of gardenias. She came down the steps, running over the walk, and found the car exactly where she'd left it. She almost saw Jacob sitting there, the phone still pressed against his ear, but when she stuck her head into the window, she found the car was empty, the keys still hanging in the ignition. Lily wasn't sure what to make of this, and as she sat in the passenger seat, her mind started trying to make sense of what she'd seen. She realized her marriage, her whole life, was full of these little lies. Her mind made up memories to protect her from reality, but the house showed her the truth. She remembered what her father had done to her mother and what her husband did to their son, and she felt disgust well up inside her. "How could I be so stupid?" she whispered, tears coming unbidden. That still didn't explain why she had seen herself down in that cellar in such a state. As Lily thought about it, she realized she needed answers. She climbed over the driver's side and turned the key. The engine came to life, and Lily peeled the tires as she headed home. She wouldn't feel safe in that house until she checked the basement to be sure of what was there. Jacob would be angry if he came back to find the car missing, and if such a place existed in her home, she would likely find herself in there if he made it home. Jacob called out to Lily, hoping to find her safe and sound as he made it to the stairs. He could hear someone upstairs, and he kept calling for his wife as he ascended. He could hear someone crying in the bedroom to the right of him, and he was afraid that she had gotten hurt, or worse, that someone had hurt her. "Sweetheart, is that you? Are you okay?" he called out. He slowly opened the door and peeked in to see himself holding their son. His wife cried as she watched him smothering their son. The baby had been crying for hours, and Jacob couldn't handle that high-pitched squeal anymore. He snapped, and it was something he regretted every day. He had tried to move from beneath the shadow of his father, especially after what he'd done to Lily, but it seemed that you never quite forgot the old ways, or the old lessons. He reached for Lily as she lay there crying, but as his hands passed through her, she turned to dust beneath his fingers. Everything melted away like dandelion fluff, and suddenly the room was empty. As he backed out of the room, he heard sobbing from the bedroom across the hall again. Jacob's hands shook as he reached for the knob, but he had to find Lily and make her understand how sorry he was for their son's death. He peeked inside as the door creaked open and could see his own bedroom. Lily was crying as she spoke to someone on the phone. She was talking about, oh God, she was talking about his little secret. She had found the root cellar, the shame he had hidden for years, and now she knew everything. He charged in, trying to stop her, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, it all just melted away. Jacob's father had often said that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and Jacob supposed he'd been right. Lily had taken a lot of convincing, a lot of mental conditioning, but Stockholm Syndrome was an interesting thing. She never remembered how she came to be in Jacob's basement after he took her from her work one evening. She never questioned how they'd been married for 12 years when he had only snatched her 7 years ago. She had accepted that there were no pictures of their wedding because of the fire that had burned their apartment. She had accepted that their son had died of SIDS too, though he thought maybe that one had been harder to swallow than the rest. In many ways, it was like her mind created answers for questions before they were asked. By the sound of it, she had been doing that for most of her childhood. Jacob's childhood had been fraught, but Lily's had been something from a pulp novel. She'd been happy to forget, happy to cloud her own mind with misty memories and rose-colored tint. But this damn house had probably shown her all sorts of things that pulled the wool from her eyes. As Jacob sat in the empty room, he wondered if prison would be worse than living in this warped memory for the rest of his life. The whispers from the house told him that he'd never get to know. There would be no open door waiting for someone like Jacob. The house had a new toy, a new rat in its cage, and Jacob would never bask in the sun again. Whew, wind's really kicking up out there. Good thing you have a nice warm spot to land, and a lot of great stories yet to come. Going from creepy houses to creepy festivals, we learn about how a town celebrates a certain festival and what the meaning might be behind it. So, let me tell you about Purga de Rata. The celebration of Purga Rinvadaro was a celebration that was highly anticipated in my town. The celebration is always capped off by the hunting of the mice, which was the highlight of the event. On the first day of the feast, we opened the door to find 3 masks attached to our doorknob. This occurred year after year for as long as I could remember, and I didn't think it was strange at all. Every year we would open the door, find the cat masks, long, wiry whiskers and pointy black ears, hanging from the doorknob to our home. There would be one for my mother, one for my father, and one for me. We would wear them at the festival, riding the rides and playing the games, lifting them only slightly to eat food at the feast as we gave praise to Saint Rocher. This year, however, was special for me. I was 13, old enough to do a day's work if I chose, old enough to have my own money and to have my own responsibilities, old enough to participate in what came after the feast, old enough to participate in the Purga de Ratas. I had always watched from the windows of the council hall with the other children as the people in the cat masks went about freeing us from the rats. You could see them sometimes, the big rats with their pointed noses and coarse whiskers, running through the streets as the cats turned them from wherever they had been hiding. I asked Mother what they were. They were larger than the rats I had seen in the pantry on occasions, and she had told me that these were the undesirables, those who Saint Rocher had chosen to purge from the community, and that it was the job of the town to become his cats and free the community of them. I asked her once if we could be chosen by Saint Rocher to be purged on that night. She told me I'd better pray it never happened. Those who were purged during the Purga de Rata were cursed and removed from the town after they were destroyed. This was the year I would discover what that truly meant. I went to the festival in my mask, excited for the night to come, as I played the games, danced the Purga de Rata, and ate at the feast. I couldn't help but think of taking to the streets with my father and mother that night to help purge the unclean from our town. Mother had said that they were Saint Rocher's enemies, said that her father had said they were filled with spirits who had brought the plague to our city when she was a girl. If they didn't purge all of them, they would bring it there again. I was excited to go out and bring honor to my family as I drove these rats out of the city, but I was a little scared too. It was that feeling you get just before doing something dangerous and exciting, like riding a wild horse. You fear the action, but you can't wait for the ride. I was a little sad, though. My friend Maria wasn't there. She never missed the festival, and not seeing her made me wonder if she was sick. Her father wasn't a nice man, my father said. He didn't support the festival, and he had tried to argue for having it canceled many times. He always seemed nice to me when I visited Maria, but I knew well enough not to argue with my father. I didn't see Maria all day, and as we went home with the setting sun, I hoped I would see her tonight. We returned home and ate at the midnight feast that my parents always ate before it was time to go to the night's work. I tucked in greedily, knowing that I would need my strength for what was to come. God help me. I was so young, I didn't know what was in store for me. As we ate, I asked my mother about the people who didn't go to the festival. She looked critically, asking what I meant. I told her I saw someone peeking through the windows of their home. They'd moved away from the window quickly, but I had marked them by their whiskers and their beady eyes. Mother said that those people were not to be trusted, and that clearly they had been infested by the spirits Saint Rocher wanted us to expel from the city that night. I nodded, making a note of that house in my mind. Their house was close to ours, and my parents and I could get there easily and chase them out. When the deep thrum of the midnight bell tolled, Father donned his mask and led us to the kitchen. There would be no need to take me to the chapel for safekeeping that night. He handed each of us a knife from the knife block, saving the sharpest knife for me. It was a long, curved fillet knife, and he told me not to be afraid to swing it hard. These aren't people anymore, and we must expunge the plague from the city. I nodded, not understanding entirely, but I soon would. We left the house, and I took them to the house I had seen earlier, seeing the other cats as they moved through the city. They were moving in clusters, groups of 5 or 10, and soon we would be taken into the clouder easily. The other cats around me were a comfortable weight, all of them people I knew, though I didn't know that I knew them. They followed us as we went, letting us lead them to the rats. The lights were off when we approached, the house dark and the windows shuttered. I figured this would be the time that we would scare the mice out of their holes. I'd seen my kitten, Georgette, scare mice out of their holes before. She would pretend to be interested in one hole, and then when the mice would poke their heads out of the other hole and come hesitantly out, she would dash at them and scare them out of the house. She would run them and run them. Her little kitten energy was boundless, until Mother finally saw them, swept them out with her broom, crying, "Purga de Rata," as she swept them from our house. But we were no kittens, it seems, and this city did not hunt like that. The stone made me jump when it crashed through the window. The window shattered inward, and I heard someone shriek. We had scared the rats, and now they would come running out. But this was also how kittens hunted. Several of the cats, the ones with clubs as well as knives, cleared the glass out of the window and climbed through easily. The shrieks from inside were undoubtedly more human than mouse-like, but when the door burst open, one of the rats ran for it, just like the rats at home. No broom came out to sweep him away. The clouder fell on him, and I saw his hands come up to reach as the knives came down. I stopped as I saw what they were doing, feeling a little sick, as I saw the blood leaking from the rat. He was bigger than I had expected, bigger than me, and he twitched as he lay there. I took a step back, not really wanting to get close, but my mother pushed me forward as her hands stopped my retreat. I looked back into her cat mask and saw her gentle eyes as she pushed me again. "Go on, honey. Get a cut in." I stepped forward, some of my excitement dulled by fear, and saw the gurgling rat looking up at me as it bled onto the cobbles. Its black eyes stared at me, and it coughed wetly, though its lips didn't move. I held my knife in a shaky hand, preparing to strike, when the rat suddenly reached out for me, locking its hand around my ankles. My fear gripped me, and I suddenly stabbed out with the knife. I stabbed the rat again and again and again, closing my eyes as I stabbed his arm, his back, his neck. The hand went limp as he flopped onto the cobbles. The Clowder cheered, and we were off again. We ran, drunk off our own power, and found a pair of rats in the street as they dodged another group. They were cutting down an alley as we came upon them, but they looked up at our group as it came close. One of them took off down the alley, but the other just stood there, frozen in terror, as the Clowder fell on her. She screamed as we stabbed her, but I broke off to pursue the other one as they finished stabbing and beating her. I didn't want her to get away, and my blood was up. I'd be lying if I said I didn't want one of the rats for myself, too. I ran after her, leaving the others behind, and found her just as she hit the wall of the alley. She turned, seeing me, and started looking around fitfully. I could almost taste her fear as I closed in, knife at the ready. I, too, would purge my town of rats. "Please," she begged, and her words gave me pause. She was speaking. Did rats speak? None of the rats I'd ever seen spoke. Of course, none of the rats I had ever seen were big either. The speaking rat made me falter for a moment, and she took full advantage of this as she tried to reason with me. Please don't hurt me. I'll give you whatever you want. I just don't want to die." I heard the Clowder coming up behind me, yelling as they came, and their presence gave me strength. I ran forward, and I shoved the knife at her, the blade sinking into her abdomen as she tried to back away. As it went in, I yelled, "Purga de Rata!" and I could see her dress starting to redden as her hands gripped the knife. She cut her fingers, and she fell to her knees as the Clowder came into the alley with a shout of mirth. I pulled the knife out and ran to my father. He pulled me into his arms and whispered, "You're a natural." At that moment, I was so proud. My family was doing something special, and we were united. Sometimes it almost felt like we lived on our own, only seeing each other for dinner. But now we were doing something we could all enjoy, and I couldn't wait till next year. I didn't have the slightest idea what I was doing, but I would soon find out. I followed the Clowder, growing bolder as we went, until we came to the next house. They pounded on the door, yelling for the rats to come out and face their fate. Everyone else was waiting expectantly, waiting for the door to open so they could charge the house and kill these rats. I was confused, though. There must have been a mistake. This couldn't be the rats' house. They were looking for rocks to break the window, but I just shook my head and felt my confusion mount. This couldn't be the right house. This was Maria's house. The door opened suddenly, and Maria's father stepped out onto the stoop. He wasn't wearing a mask. His face was set in a stoic cast, and he raised his rifle and pointed it at the mob. Some of them backed away, but most of them only seemed to take more pleasure from his presence. They mumbled to themselves, gripping their knives and preparing to charge. Maria's father cast his gaze around at them, his eyes falling on me for a moment before sliding away. "I'm not wearing that damn mask. This whole celebration is an abomination. If you mean to take my family, then you can come and try. I'll take a few of you with me. Just remember, which of you will be wearing a rat mask next year?" I backed away from the Clowder, slowly, my knife hitting the cobbles. No one noticed the metallic sound, or the scream that followed it as the rifle blammed loudly. One of the cats had charged him, thinking he wouldn't shoot, and now he lay bleeding on his doorstep. The gun went off again a moment later, but I didn't see who had been killed that time. I was running, head down, my mask forgotten, as I turned from the carnage that I now understood was not a magic festival or a fight for our town from giant rats. We were killing our friends, our neighbors, and I would never understand why. I ran as the tears streamed down my face, and I didn't stop running until the sounds of rats and cats were behind me. I ran until the woods enveloped me, the lush fairy tale woods that seemed to surround our home. The trees whipped at me, the roots pulled at me, and I just kept running. I ran from the horror, from the chaos, and I didn't stop until the ground went out from under me. Suddenly I was tumbling, I was rolling down something, and I put my hands up to my face to protect myself. I was so confused, so frightened, and when I hit my head on something, my vision got very blurry. I kept rolling, struggling to maintain my consciousness. I was slapping against the bushes and banging against small rocks, and when I finally came to a rest, I felt warm, solid ground beneath me. When the lights engulfed me, leaving me in a warm circle, I passed out. I woke up in a hospital. The nurses said I had been found lying on a major highway, a truck driver having brought me here after calling the police. I had been unconscious for a while, a day at least, and I had a pretty massive head wound that would need to heal. The doctor said I had a small skull fracture, and that I definitely had a concussion. They kept me for a month, most of which was trying to get me to tell them who I was and where I was from. I feigned memory loss. The women in Mother's books lost their memories sometimes after an accident. I did not want to go back home. I knew for a fact that if I went home, after running away from the festival, that my family might very well find rat masks on their door next year. I also didn't want to face the wrath of my parents and my community. No one refused to participate in the festival, or, like Maria's father, they were made to play the rats. After a month, I was sent to an orphanage where I was adopted. The country I'm from doesn't have the best track record when it comes to placing children into foster homes, or even having them adopted by good families, but I suppose I got lucky. Glenda and Mark were from the United States, here to do missionary work. When Glenda heard about my story, she became interested in me. She said that it seemed to be God's will that she help me, and they adopted me right then and there. They stayed for a few years, helping me get back on my feet, and when they went home, they helped me gain citizenship and become a United States citizen. I moved with them to San Diego and attended college. I never told them about my village, or the Purga de Rata, and they never pushed me. I think they suspected that my amnesia was self-inflicted, and they're honestly the best parents I ever could have asked for. I'm 30 now, married with a new baby in a place of my own. My husband, Marco, is a wonderful father, and we couldn't be happier. He works as a civil engineer for a large company, and I work as a nurse when I'm not at home with Hugo. Glenda and Mark, my mom and dad, are always welcome at our house, and I can't imagine a better life than the one I have. A life that my past is threatening to take away. You see, when I went to get the mail today, I noticed something hanging on the door of our apartment. I saw the masks, laughing and thinking it was a Halloween thing from the neighbors. But when I picked them up, the wiry whiskers stuck painfully into my hand. I dropped them and stared in horror. They were masks, all right. 3 of them, and they all were gray lacquered faces of rats. The whiskers were frayed metal wires, and the nose of one had been broken in the fall, a delicate black bulb that now lay on the pavement beside the mask. There were 3 masks, as I said, and the third was the one that filled me with the most dread. 2 were normal-sized, easily capable of fitting an adult face, but the third was small, delicate, the eyes carved to make it look scared and sad. A mask for a baby. There was a note inside one, and I thought I would tear it as my shaking hands reached out to open it. The paper was rough, handmade, and the ink was thick and blocky. The village made its own paper, its own ink, and rarely traded with others. I had no doubt that the masks had been made by the same old man that used to make them every year. I felt the tears come on, and as I read the note, the concrete bit into my knees as I went down to them to sob into the paper. The note read, "Joyous Purga de Rata. Join us this evening for the Purga de Rata. If you cannot attend, don't worry. We will bring the celebration to you. Let's hope none of you wake up and find a rat mask on your home anytime soon. But, should you escape from it, maybe jot down some notes. I could always use a new story. As kids, we all tell weird tales, maybe things we made up, maybe even things we didn't. But this next story reminds us to always take those tales with a grain of salt. Otherwise, we might find ourselves the subject of playground tales. And when she came out of the bathroom, her entire class was gone. The third grade class of 77 was never seen again. But they say sometimes you can still hear laughter in the woods outside. The door opened, and we all covered our eyes as Reggie grinned in at us. "I knew you guys would be telling stories again. You should have waited." Becky sighed. Randall chuffed unhappily, and I tried to smile as I told Reggie to close the door before someone saw him. We were in the old equipment storage shed by the playfield, and if an adult saw us, they would make us get out. We like to tell scary stories. The scarier the locale, the better. The old equipment shed had been unanimously decided upon because A, it was home to a lot of creepy crawlies, and B, it didn't let in a lot of light. We had to keep finding new places to tell stories because the ones we had got old pretty quick. You can tell stories in a place for only so long before it stops being scary, but also, sometimes it was because the teachers chased us out. The third reason was stepping in right now and grinning like a shot fox at us. Reggie was the weird kid of PS24, and he had earned that title honestly. It wasn't just because he was overweight to the point of being a blob, and it wasn't just because his hair was full of thick, gross-looking dandruff. It wasn't just because his dad was the janitor and seemed to love the job, or because he ate sauerkraut and onion sandwiches for lunch. The reason was that Reggie just emanated an aura of unsettledness. I got the feeling about him that I got about certain adults or dogs, the ones your parents tell you to stay away from. Reggie had a feeling of danger, of not rightness about him, and it made me uneasy. It didn't help that he had adopted us as his best friends this year. Becky, Randall, and I had been friends since kindergarten, but we had managed to avoid getting too close to Reggie. That had lasted until 4th grade, when we were in Miss Novak's class together. Reggie had decided that we were his best friends. He didn't have any regular friends, and he adopted us as his. This led to a year of smelling his sandwiches at lunch, having him follow us on our playground games, and listening to his wheezy, resting breath as he sat in our pod in class. We had hoped that we would be rid of him at the end of the year, but when our parents had signed us up for summer school care, a kind of after-school care during the summer, we had groaned as Reggie came in and saw us. He explained that the school had agreed to let him attend for free if his dad worked through the summer, and we all prayed that he would be in a different 5th grade class than us when next year rolled around. "Well, since you've already started telling stories, I got a good one," Reggie said. "It's the tale of the skinned raccoon." Reggie started to lay out his story about a skinned raccoon that had been seen one night while his dad worked late, and we all tried to pretend that it wasn't the most gruesome thing we had ever heard. The way he described the raccoon made me think that he had not only really seen it, but that he had probably skinned it himself. He said it had left little red footprints on the floor as it walked away, and his father had been angry when he found them. "We followed them all the way to the woods, but we never did find the raccoon." We all made an appreciatively scared noise, but I think we were all just hoping that he would let us move on. When Mrs. Simon pushed the door open a moment later, telling us this was off limits and we needed to leave, it was almost a relief. We left the shed, trying to kind of lose Reggie as we did, but we knew he'd find us again. It was impossible to hide from Reggie. He knew everywhere and everything about the school, all the hidden nooks and crannies. His dad had keys to any door in the school, and Reggie often borrowed some of them to get into places he shouldn't. His dad always covered for him, for some reason, so he never got in any trouble. It's weird, it was like his dad was scared of him sometimes. But he was a grown-up, and there was no reason that he should have been afraid of him. As we left the shed, running into the sunshine of the triple-digit day, Reggie said something that caught my interest. "That's a shame. I was going to tell you guys about how I saw the missing kids a few nights ago." The missing kids? That was a big topic of discussion these days. Last year, 4 kids had gone missing from PS24. A first grader named Mary Edwards, a third grader named George Tate, a kindergartner named Savannah Marcus, and a 5th grader named Robbie Fust. They had come to school and then just never left. The cameras at the school left a lot to be desired. That's what my dad said, anyway. And they hadn't seen the kids leave school by any of the other exits either. My dad works for the police department, and he told me I needed to be extra safe until they found whoever was doing this. They suspected a teacher, but the question was, how would they get the kids out? If they were hiding the kids in the school somehow, then they would have been found by now. Wouldn't they? They had searched the school a bunch. The disappearance had hung about the school like ghosts, and it sounded like the teachers were afraid that they might lose their job if it kept happening. I thought about what he had said until after lunch and decided I would just have to ask him. We were playing outside, the day a little cooler now that the sun was heading towards down, and Reggie was leaning against the fence and watching people as he often did. Reggie liked to just sit there and look at people, watching them as they went past, but he didn't make up stories about them or anything. He just watched them like the animals in the zoo watch fat kids. It was really weird. "So Reggie," I said, and Becky and Randall looked surprised since we never really talked to him and just accepted when he talked at us. "What do you mean that you were going to tell us about the missing kids?" Reggie turned his gaze away from a first grader who was chasing a ball with some effort, and his grin was downright predatory. "Oh yeah, I saw them the other night when Dad was working late." "Like you saw them, I said. "Like you know where they are." "Well, yeah," Reggie said. "They're under the school." I looked at Becky and Randall, and the two of them now looked as interested as I was. "Why haven't you told anyone?" Reggie shrugged. "No one asked." I could have smacked myself in the forehead. "Well, can you take us there?" Reggie was already grinning like a creepypasta monster, but I saw a glimmer pass over his eye, and I should have known to take it back. He wanted to show us. He wanted us to come with him, and I suddenly didn't want to go. But it didn't really matter if I wanted to or not. If there was a chance I could help my dad find those kids, I wanted to. Dad was worried about losing his job, too, if they didn't find somebody, and I didn't want that to happen. "Yeah, I'll show you. Come on." Reggie looked over at Mrs. Simon and Mrs. Gay to make sure they weren't paying attention, and the 4 of us headed towards the school. Reggie led us into a side door, through the 3rd grade hallway, and to the middle of the school to an area called the Square. The Square had been a part of PS24 since it was built in the 70s. It's an area of grass with a couple of small trees growing there. How the roots don't mess up the school, I don't know, but it's a place that a lot of kids usually go to between classes. There's a utility building in the middle of it, and that was where Reggie took us. He pulled out a long key from his short pants and unlocked the door, ushering us into the little building before closing us into total darkness. Then he pulled the chain on a light hanging from the ceiling, and we were left looking around a small square room of tools and other implements. "There's no one here," Becky said, looking around before looking back at Reggie with a scared look. "Well, yeah," Reggie said, grabbing an edge of what turned out to be a carpet. "Otherwise, they would have found them by now." He pulled the carpet back and revealed a hatch in the floor. It was flush against the ground, with no wheel or handle to poke out, and if you didn't know it was there, you would never even see the rug. Reggie squeezed a pair of handles and pulled the hatch up to reveal a ladder that led down into the earth. Reggie started climbing down like he'd done it 1,000 times before, and when he saw that we weren't following, he asked us if we were coming. "They're down here. If you want to see them, then you'll have to come down," he said, making his way down again as if the matter was settled. I looked at Randall, but he just shook his head and went for the door. "No way, man. This is way too weird for me." He put a hand on the knob, but when he turned it, the door was locked. I went to look for the flip lock that would let us out, but the other side of the knob had a keyhole. I'd never seen anything like this, and I realized that Reggie had the only key to the door. We were locked in with him, for better or worse, and he would need to let us out again. I looked at the hole and figured it beat being stuck in here. At least, we might find another way out if we went down. We descended the ladder slowly, the darkness thick around us. I tried turning on the light on my watch so we could see a little, but it didn't provide much light. We spread out, trying to find a switch, and when the light suddenly came on, I jumped. We were in a big room, like a storage unit, and it stretched the length of the grassy area above us. The ceiling was metal, the walls were metal, the floor was concrete, and the place was full of boxes. They were stacked up to the ceiling in some places, and I wondered what this place had been before it was just here to store things. We grouped up, moving around as we checked the room, and I saw something speckled on the floor. It looked like someone had spilled juice, or maybe paint, and as we came around a big stack of boxes, I saw another door. This one wasn't locked, and as it came open, we saw that it led down a long hallway that went further into the underground. "What is this place, anyway?" Becky asked, sounding a little scared as we followed the tunnel. "I'm not sure," Randall said, "but my mom told me that she used to go here, back in the early 80s, and people used to talk about there being bomb shelters or something under the school. She never saw them, but she said that was something the other kids told stories about." "You think that's what these are?" I asked, seeing a door coming up on our left. Randall shrugged. "Maybe, I guess. It would make sense for it to be in the very middle of the school." We tried the door, but it was locked tight. The next 3 were also locked, but the 5th door opened pretty easily and held what we were looking for. Well, not exactly what we were looking for, but we found the missing kids. The room had been some kind of workroom that had been turned into just another storage room. The boxes that the kids were lying on were drenched in blood. They were dead, thankfully. If they hadn't been, they would have been screaming. They were naked, their clothes lying in rags, and someone had been very busy. Their arms and legs had been removed, the bones broken cruelly. Their stomachs had been opened, their entrails hanging around them like snakes, and a few of them were missing eyes. The little girl, Mary, I thought, had her jaw pulled off and her tongue was missing. Becky started throwing up. Randall sounded like he wanted to scream, and when someone started laughing, I knew we'd stumbled into a trap. It was Reggie, his bulk blocking the door. He had a knife, the long kind you found in a kitchen, and he was grinning like a creep again. He just kept standing there, not trying to come after us, and it was clear that he realized, like we had, that we weren't going anywhere. "Looks like you found the lost kids. Guess it's time to add 3 more to my little collection." "Come on, Reggie," I said, trying to talk our way out of this. This isn't funny. You got us pretty good with these Halloween decorations, but enough's enough. You win. Just let us out so we can..." When he slashed me across my chest, slicing a long red line that split my t-shirt and my skin beneath, I hissed in pain and stumbled back. "There's no getting out now. You're staying here forever. I meant to get you all before school ended, but there was never a good opportunity. Now, we can be friends forever. All 8 of us." I was scared, but Randall had clearly gone past scared. He screamed like a cat that's been stomped on and ran at Reggie, shoving him as the big boy stabbed him in the shoulder. Even though he got him, Reggie was still off balance. He fell into some of the boxes, and we scattered. Randall had gone back the way we came, Becky running after him, but I knew there was no way out that way. I went left, running into the unknown, and when someone roared like an angry beast behind me, I charged heedlessly. I don't know how long I ran. I don't know how far I ran, but when I slammed into a ladder, it was hard enough to make my eyes blur. I shook myself as I started to climb. I couldn't let him catch me. If he caught me, I'd be dead. I climbed and climbed and climbed, and when I got to the top, I pushed at the hatch and almost screamed when it wouldn't move. I pushed and pushed, getting a little bit of give, but it always came back down again. I couldn't make it budge, not even a little bit, and as I shoved at it, I started hearing something down the tunnel behind me. It wasn't loud, not like someone running, but it was feet coming up the concrete. I screamed and shoved at the hatch, feeling it give but not open. I squinted as something fell on my face, dirt or something, and I had to brace my back against the wall so I could use both hands. I got brief flashes of light as I shoved, just the slight glimmer from the edges, and when I heard the laughter from the bottom of the ladder, I kept shoving, praying to God to help me. "Found you," Reggie sing-songed, putting his foot on the bottom rung of the ladder. "You might as well just come down. That hatch doesn't open. I don't know where it comes out at, but it's not gonna help you." He started climbing, and I felt like crying as I shoved at the hatch. My arms were hurting almost as badly as my chest, and I was afraid that he would get me before the latch could open. He would cut my legs, and I'd fall down the ladder. Then he'd do whatever he wanted, probably drag me back to his little room and finish me off. I shoved and shoved, yelling for help as he got closer and closer. He was climbing slow, on purpose, really stretching it out, and his words were muffled by the knife that he held in his teeth. "Scream all you like. No one is coming to help." But we both squinted when the hatch came slowly open, and I saw the faces of about 7 or 8 kids I recognized from the program. They helped me out, yelling for a teacher as Reggie retreated down the ladder. They had seen him, though. They knew he had been down there, and as the teachers came running, I was lying on the grass and breathing heavily. I was in a corner of the field, the back corner by the utility shed, and the kids had been playing kickball when they heard a loud shrieking noise that had come from that direction. It was the hinges on the door, long ago grown over with grass and covered with dirt. They came over and saw it opening and closing, and when they heard me yelling, they came to help pull me out. The group of them had managed to fling it open, and Mrs. Simons was running to see what they were talking about. I breathed a sigh of relief. I told them what had happened, told them how Becky and Randall were still down there, and Mrs. Simons sent someone to call the police, but wouldn't go down there herself. If what you're saying is true, then it would be dangerous for us to go down there until the police get here. They came pretty quick, my dad with them, and I told them the story again and begged them to save my friends before he hurt them. They went down the ladder, guns drawn and flashlights out, and my dad and another officer told me to take them to the shed that Reggie had brought us down from. I took him there, but the door was standing open, and I knew that Reggie had fled. Dad went down the ladder, and to my relief came up with Becky and Randall. They were scared, but unharmed. They told us how Reggie had come running for the front door and climbed up while they hid behind some boxes. They said he hadn't even noticed them as they ran, and he seemed pretty scared. They took the bodies out in bags, and the whole place was covered in tape. They got Reggie's dad, too, and he told them how he had known there was something off about his son, but he hadn't known what it was. I know it's not right to be afraid of your kid, but I was really afraid that he would kill me one night. The police decided he hadn't had anything to do with it, though I heard the school fired him for knowingly letting Reggie take his keys and get into restricted areas. As for Reggie, no one knows what happened to him. Wherever he ran to, he was never seen again. Now the ghost stories around school are about Reggie and how he's just waiting for his next chance to kill more kids. If they'd been down there in those tunnels that day, if they'd had stood face to face with the psycho while he contemplated killing us, they might not be so quick to tell stories about him. We're going to head right into a classic. A classic that one of these days I intend to do a book about. I'm just dragging my heels a little because I've got projects I want to do more. But it's such a great story, and it's honestly one of my earlier works, so I do hope you enjoy Patches. I ran into the house and slammed the door behind me. Looking around frantically, I called for my parents. At that moment, I became about 4 years old again. My fear congealed in my guts when I realized they weren't home. They were gone, out of town, wouldn't be back until tomorrow night. That's why I'd been staying at Billy's in the first place. That's why Billy was, "Thump, thump, thump. Open up, Johnny, I know you're in there," said a slurry voice, sing-songing the words as the owner tried to bowl the door down. I turned and shot the bolt before backing away from the front door as though it might bite me. The wood on the thick old door, solid enough to rattle the windows when it slammed, looked like it was bowing in as whatever was on the other side pushed at the wood. The door warped and twisted and suddenly seemed made of clear film as handprints imposed their image into it. It couldn't be. It just couldn't be. My dad had said that door was a foot thick when he installed it, and now it was bending and warping like melted wax. It was too much. I ran into the kitchen and slammed the door. I threw a chair in front of it, too, for good measure. After I was certain that I had jammed it in there good, I backed away slowly with wide, staring eyes. I jumped suddenly and shrieked like a tea kettle when my jeans-clad bottom came into contact with something solid. I felt stupid when I realized it was just the fridge. Even laughed a little, thinking maybe I'd exaggerated this whole thing. That's when I heard a terrible cracking sound coming from the living room. It was the sound of wood splintering as its dimensions are violated. He'd be through soon. He'd be through, and he'd have me. Patches would be through. Billy, Randall, Scotty, and I had been friends since we were young. We'd been inseparable, thick as thieves, and the terrors of our neighborhood since we were old enough to walk. Don't get me wrong or anything. We weren't bullies. We weren't bad boys. We ate our vegetables. We were in before the streetlights came on. We kept our grades up. We were polite to anyone that we met. The problem was that we liked to play pranks. What child doesn't like to pull a prank now and then? A tack on a teacher's chair, a whoopee cushion on a classmate's seat, a frog in a backpack. We'd done them all, and it had given us a bit of a reputation as troublemakers. When school ended for the summer, and the four of us moved on to middle school, I'm pretty sure the teachers at our old elementary school threw a party to celebrate. We were all just looking forward to summer, a summer of pranks and mischief, but none of us could have foreseen what was to come. After 3 weeks of no school, limited parental supervision, and way too much free time on our hands, we started to get bored. We'd pulled some pranks. Putting mud in Miss Laverne's washing machine had almost gotten us caught, but most people were already wary of us because of our reputation as pranksters, so it was getting hard to pull a really good prank like we wanted. One afternoon, though, the four of us put our heads together and thought of all the people we hadn't pranked yet, and only one person in town came to mind: Patches. The front door crashed open like it had been shot with a cannon, but in the wake of the break-in, I was treated to nothing but a long silence from the living room. No footsteps headed towards the kitchen, no slurry voice trying to call me out. Just a long, uncomfortable silence as I sat with my back against the solid old refrigerator and waited to see what would happen. I counted in my head, 1, 2, 3, and when I got to 100, I worked my way up to my feet and took a hesitant step towards the kitchen door. That's when the knob started to turn frantically. It turned left, then right, then left again, and someone pushed against it and swore loudly when the chair stopped it from opening. He slammed against the lame barricade, and I saw one of his bloodshot eyes peek through the crack as it trained onto me. The eye went wide in mirth, and I heard the slurry voice call my name again. He rattled at the door a few more times before opening it as far as he could so I could hear him. Johnny! Johnny, Johnny, Johnny! Don't you want to see what you did to your old pal Patches? Don't you want to see what you and your friends did to me? Maybe when I'm through this door, he slammed his weight against it again, I'll give you a taste of what I gave the others. Billy squealed like a little girl when I twisted his fat head right off his shoulders. He screamed through the door as he put his whole weight into the hit, and the legs of the chair started bucking as it got ready to give. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I tore up the stairs as fast as I could, taking the little staircase in the kitchen. Just as my feet touched the bottom step, I heard the door crash open, and I put on a burst of speed. As I hit the halfway point, something grabbed my ankle, and I fell hard onto the rough wooden steps. I bit my tongue on the way down, and felt my lip split as I hit the stairs. One look at what stood at the bottom, though, and both of those pains were nothing. His hand was wrapped in the same threadbare mittens he'd worn in life, and it clutched my ankle as it looked like his arm stretched from his body, so it hung halfway down the stairs behind him like a fire hose. Patches stood at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in his soiled, cast-off clothes, and grinned his gap-toothed smile, which had become decidedly moldy in death. He started pulling on me as I struggled to get back to my feet. Patches was a tramp, a sort of city pet, and the residents thought he gave our town a colorful appearance. They'd all grown up with Mayberry and Mayfield. Small towns were expected to have a friendly tramp who stole the occasional pie or was caught sleeping off a bottle at the bus station. Patches never stole any pies. He was welcome to a piece on the front porch of almost any house in town. But he was drunk most any old night of the week. He could be seen staggering out of Gemmer's and down to his camp by the river most any old night of the week. He never caused any trouble, though, and the police never felt the need to throw him in the drunk tank or hassle him at all. I would have called us friends at one time. Everybody in town hired Patches to do odd jobs for a little money now and then. He had a rusty old push mower that he'd used to cut people's grass with, and he claimed he'd been a handyman of some sort before the war. He had enough skill with tools to back it up, so most any afternoon he could be seen cutting grass or shoveling snow or fixing something for a few dollars to feed and medicate himself. Medicating is what Dad called it when Patches got drunk. Patches had laughed when I'd told him so. He fixed my bike tire once, and he'd taken Scotty Randall and I on a hike in the woods once when we had asked if he knew any good camping spots. He was a nice guy, sober or drunk, and I don't think I'd ever seen anyone in town have any trouble with him. We shouldn't have pranked him. It was wrong. I wish now that I could take it back. Pranking him had been Billy's idea, but we'd all gone along with it. Billy's dad owned the hardware store, and he was just about the only guy in town that didn't really trust Patches. Billy's dad had it out for tramps and vags, and he taught his son to be mindful of them as well. Tramps like a no-good dog pretending to be good. He'd tell us when he saw Patches wandering around, you might pet him 100 times and not get bit, but when you take your eyes off him for half a heartbeat, he'll bite you. I didn't think Patches was like that, but we knew better than to argue with an adult, so we just nodded and said we'd be careful. Billy had a roach, the rubber kind that you got from the joke shop for a nickel, and he put it deep down in a corned beef sandwich and told me to take it over to Patches. Why me? I asked, not really wanting to prank Patches, but not wanting to seem chicken. He trusts you. Your dad's always paying him to do stuff, and I've seen him talking to you on the front porch, Billy said. He hasn't gotten work for a few days now, what with this heat, and he's probably getting hungry. He'll bite down on that sandwich and see the roach and freak out. We all laughed a little at the thought of Patches biting down on that roach and freaking out. We'd have all freaked out, too, if we found a roach in a sandwich. Afterwards, we'd all have a good laugh and find someone else to prank. He looked up from where he was sunning himself and smiled his gap-toothed smile at me. Oh, well, hey there, Johnny-O. What you say, old sport? He asked in his thick southern drawl. Nothing much. My mom packed me a corned beef sandwich for lunch, but I'm not really a big fan of corned beef. I thought you might like it. I held the sandwich out to him and tried my best not to smile. Patches took the bait at once. Oh, well, say there, that's mighty fine of you, old sport. Been here a day and a half since I had me any victuals. He took the sandwich and had a big bite, chewing with relish. "By the way, I saw Miss Laverne's washing machine." He slapped his knee as he gave a big donkey laugh. "I was 3 hours cleaning the mud out of that contraption. I guess I should thank you boys for the work." He laughed a little and took another bite, and when he did, I saw the gleaming head of the plastic roach sticking out of the sandwich. I started to point it out, but he kept right on laughing and telling me about the muddy washing machine and how hard it had been to get all the mud out of it. Apparently, he'd had to remove the drum and rinse it in the yard and then put the whole contraption back together. When he'd finished, and it was time to get paid, he took another bite and said through a mouthful of corned beef, "You know that old skinflint only gave me $1 for all that work. She tells me not to spend it all in one place." He brayed more laughter, but as he went to bite again, something happened. He wheezed a bit, his throat working to swallow the load of corned beef, and I realized with horror that he'd swallowed the plastic roach, too. The mat of corned beef and the hard plastic roach were stuck in his throat, and as he coughed and gasped, I realized he was choking. Billy, Randall, and Scotty broke cover and ran over to see what had happened, but by then it was already too late. He had melted to his knees in the dirt, coughing his life out as the wad of half-chewed food hung like plaster in his throat. All the backslapping in the world wouldn't do anything for him. We sent Scotty and Randall to call an ambulance, but Patches was dead before they even left the riverside. His face was a dark purple color at the end as he clawed at his throat. Billy and I clapped him on the back again and again, but we might as well have been slapping a tree trunk. If you've never seen a man choke to death, then you may not know what it looks like, but I'm here to tell you that it's not as clean as it looks on TV. Patches hacked and coughed, tried to bring it up, clawed at his throat until his skin bled, and then, finally, he gave both of us a final look and pitched over onto his face, a look of terror and confusion stamped there forever. The hand gripped my ankle, and I could feel his fingers trying to twist it through the shoe. Maybe he meant to break it. Maybe he just wanted to make me hurt bad enough to let go. Whatever his intention, I wasn't about to play along. I twisted my foot a little and let the sneaker slip off as it slapped back into his palm like a rubber band. Patches howled in rage, but I wasn't going to give him a chance to recover. I sprinted upstairs and slammed my door closed behind me. I shot the lock and pushed the desk in front of the door as I thought about how best to escape. I needed to get out. I needed to escape, but I needed a plan before I went. I grabbed my backpack from the closet and threw some clothes into it, taking the $10 out of my desk I'd been saving for a new bike and putting it in my pocket. I stuffed my scout sleeping bag in as well. I felt a surge of joy for half a second when I remembered my old rifle my dad had used for hunting ducks in the fall, but that joy withered when I remembered that it was locked up in my dad's gun safe in the basement. I settled for a Swiss Army knife and a little fire starter kit that Randall had given me for my birthday, and took one last look around. Some baseball cards went in, maybe I could sell them, and a nice pocket watch my granddad had given me before I stopped and realized it was too quiet outside. Why wasn't he trying to get in? I put my hiking boots on and stuffed some socks into the bag before I slung it on and looked at the window. It would be a long drop to the ground, but I could hang off the kitchen roof and maybe not break my ankle if I was careful. My eyes flicked back to the door, and for a moment, I felt the urge to fling it open and confront my attacker head on. The suicidal urge passed quickly, though, and I crept over to the door and laid my ear against it instead, trying to hear what might be going on the other side. The bang from the other side made me jump back in fright, and Patches laughed his donkey bray. "Ha ha ha ha! Come out, Johnny! There's no escape now!" The ambulance had come, and the paramedics had pronounced him DRT, dead right there. Warner Mads, the fat volunteer firefighter who was on paramedic duty that day, had laughed when he said it, but none of the rest of us found it very funny. We all watched them put him on the stretcher and cover him with a sheet before they slid him into the covered truck they used as an ambulance and took him to Porter's mortuary. We spent the next week in a state of pure dread. "What if they find that roach in his throat?" Randall would say as we tried to get back to normal. "What if they cut him open and find it, and they decide that we killed him?" Billy punched him in the arm after we had all ignored him for about the 1,000th time. "So what if they do? It's not like we meant to kill him. We just wanted to prank him, that's all." But what? Randall started, but Billy punched him again, and Randall knocked off so he could rub at his arm. Shut up, Randy. If you keep talking about it, then someone's going to start asking questions. Why don't you guys come stay over at my house? My dad's working the late shift, and Johnny's parents are out of town, so he's staying with me anyway. We can have a sleepover and forget all about this crap. We all agreed that sounded like fun, and when the sun set Friday night, we were all sitting around a camp lantern in Billy's room telling scary stories. Billy had wanted a fire, but his dad had absolutely forbidden it, and so the best we could hope for was the small lantern on the floor of his room. His mom had gone to bed shortly after dinner, saying how tired she was, and we'd been left to our own devices for hours. We'd played games, watched a little TV in the living room, and raided the kitchen for snacks before finally deciding that it was time for the traditional scary stories. Billy got to tell the first one, since it was his house, and he told us about an escaped asylum patient who'd killed the previous owner of this very house. He claimed that on quiet nights you could still hear them begging for their lives, and the almost inaudible sound of a man dragging his knife along the wall as he hunted for the last of the children in the house. Randy got pretty scared, but that was far from new. After Patches, he seemed to be scared by most everything. Thinking of Patches made me think of a story of my own to tell, but I hesitated and let Scotty go first. Scotty told a story about a skinned dog who killed a bunch of boys on a camping trip, and even though a skinned dog, with bones poking out and his jaws full of slobber, sounded a little scary, it was pretty stupid all told. When one of the boys managed to kill it and discovered that there was a whole pack of them that then ripped him to shreds, we all rolled our eyes and threw our pillows at him. He laughed and threw his back, and one pillow fight later, Billy asked if I had a story. I do, actually, but it's not really a story. I thought I saw Patches the other day. Everyone went quiet. Randall looked like a goose had walked over his grave. Scotty sucked air through his teeth, and Billy punched me in the arm in a less than playful way. That ain't funny, man. That ain't funny a little bit. But I told him I wasn't joking. I'd seen him on and off for days since his death. Pressed up against the glass of the grocery store, his gap teeth covered in mold and his face a purple and red patchwork. At his old camp when my dad and I drove past, and even when I didn't see him, I could swear I smelled the odor of peppermint candy and rock gut whiskey, the smells of Patches. But last night was the worst yet. I woke up all of a sudden, and there was someone standing at the end of my bed. I thought it might be my dad, checking up on me, and then I smelled the peppermint and the sweet smell of alcohol, and I knew who it was. I didn't say anything, but he smiled at me from the foot of my bed, and his mossy teeth glinted in the moonlight. "That was a rotten trick, Johnny," he whispered, and his voice was hoarse and cracking. "Maybe I'll come play a trick on you boys sometime. See how you like it. Sleep tight then." Then I blinked, and he was just gone. They all sat there gape-mouthed for a heartbeat or two, and then Randall started laughing. It wasn't real laughter, not really, but the crazy, jagged laughter that people make when they're scared and they don't know what else to do. He reached out and grabbed a big handful of popcorn and said, "Good one, Johnny," as he stuffed it into his mouth and kept laughing. The laughs turned into gasps, though, as he started to choke on the popcorn. The three of us got up, wanting to stop him before he choked to death, but as he knelt hacking, we could see his hands clawing not at his throat, but at the black-gloved hands wrapped around his neck. Patches had leaned around the back of his head then, grinning like a monster in a movie, and Randall's clutching hands had died like two birds in their death throes. We backed away from him, not sure what to make of this grisly phantom, and he stood to his full height so he could tower over us. Randall lay still on the floor then, his coughing done, and the three of us silently wondered who would be next. "So, Billy, you like roaches, do you?" the cadaverous thing asked, turning towards the terrified boy, who stood frozen to the spot. "Well, here then. Have some, won't you?" Billy gagged, and a single glistening roach fell from his lips. He stared at it dumbly before he retched, and a cascade of them pattered to the floor and scattered like roaches. He went to all fours and kept vomiting up the glistening insects. his body racked with sobs and heaves, as Patches laughed merrily over his handiwork. It was too much. I bolted for the door and never saw what happened to Scotty. I threw open the living room door and ran out into the night, but I could hear the laughter of that mad apparition behind me as I fled for the safety of home. I believed, in my youth, in the talismanic protection of home, and as Patches dogged my heels, I could see it getting closer and closer before me. I found my keys and rammed them into the lock, and as the door closed behind me, I was certain I was safe. Sitting in my room now, I realized I would never be safe again. Sitting on my sleeping bag and writing this down, I realized I haven't been safe for the last 20 years. I fled that night with my backpack and my fear, and God forgive me, I never looked back. I later found out that the deaths of my 3 friends were the talk of the small town, and many believed that I had been abducted by whoever had done the killing. I used the money I had to get as far away as I could from my hometown, and when it was gone, I worked for men who would hire a boy my age to do a day's work. This was 1974, so there were kids on the run all over, and one more didn't really strike much interest. When I couldn't work, I begged, and when I found someone willing to take me in for a few days, I stayed. Eventually, though, I would have to move on again or risk being caught in the shadow of Patches. Patches didn't stay in my hometown, after all. No matter where I went, I would see him somewhere eventually, reflected in the window of a store, half hidden in an alley between 2 buildings. Sometimes I'd smell that sickly sweet smell of him and know it was time to get a move on. I took up the bottle early, and as I got older, I came to realize that in my own sad way, I had become Patches. I had become a living monument to the man I had killed on accident, and I suppose I was just looking for a place like my hometown where I could feel safe. I guess I've found it now. The truck dropped me off by the familiar river I had so often swam in when I was young, and as the sun set, I found the ragged remains of Patches' old camp. The town has changed, as I knew it would, and the attendant at the corner store gave me a dirty look as I used my last $5 to pick up a bottle of Irish Rose whiskey. I didn't care. By tomorrow, I'd just be another curiosity piece in the local paper. Homeless man found murdered by the river, it would likely say. And after 20 years of running, I guess that's not too bad. The bottle's half gone now. So was the sun as I sit here making my final notes. I'm sitting in the spot where his camp used to be, and the sounds of the river, the frogs, and the crickets just tuning up behind me, are almost soothing as I wait for my death to come. He'll find me now, I'm sure of it, and after all this time, it's almost a relief. A shadow has fallen over me, and a familiar voice asks, "You gonna finish that bottle, Johnny?" I looked up into the unchanging face of horror. I hand it up to him and smile. "Guess not." One more story for you, and you better break out the tissues, because this one's definitely a little sad. Let's go to that place where all childhood friends go. Our dogs and cats, our rabbits, the things and the creatures that so often escape our notice until we're old enough to suddenly say, "Whatever happened to my old friend?" Let's take a trip out to Pasture. I knew there was no way I could have seen him, but I could swear I saw my old dog, Blue, standing near the fence of Sanders' farm. I work out of town, the town I grew up in being pretty tiny, and I have to pass Sanders' farm anytime I come home from work. Sanders' farm has been a landmark since before I was born, and it grows most of the produce for town. Herschel Sanders runs a very successful produce stand in town, and sells crops to grocery stores all over the state. He's a bit of a local celebrity, and he seems to be the only person in town doing well for himself, besides Cotton's Antiques. He also owned the farm my parents were supposed to have dropped Blue off to when I was a kid. Blue had been a good dog, a great companion for a kid my age, but maybe a little too rambunctious for my parents' liking. He'd been a mutt with pointy ears, a thick coat of soft brown fur, and a pair of green, inquisitive eyes that never seemed to get tired of darting around for something to chase or catch. I loved him, but for 2 adults in a small house, we lived in an apartment at the time, he must have been a nightmare. The day he bit Tommy was probably one of the worst days I remember, so, of course, it was indelibly etched in my memory forever. Tommy was a lot older than me or my friends. He was 12, and we all lived in fear of him. Whenever he strode onto the little playground area off the apartment complex, 5'8" and broad in the chest, we all usually left to go play somewhere else. Unfortunately, on that day, I was playing alone on the basketball court, and didn't have time to escape. I'd been shooting baskets. I wanted to join the elementary school basketball league next year, so I wanted to get good. That's when Tommy came striding up. Blue was panting about good-naturedly, but looked up when he saw Tommy coming. He was always alone, never having any chums to play around with, and that should have been a red flag to any adult that had been watching. Even the most brutal of children have someone to pal around with, but Tommy was too antisocial and stupid mean for even other bullies to accept. "What you doing, sissy?" he asked, dragging out his limited insults he reserved for sissies or babies. I told him I was just shooting baskets, and he sneered like that was the silliest thing he'd ever heard. "That's not how you get better, stupid. Why don't you play me one-on-one? That'll get you better quicker." I agreed, thinking maybe he had decided to be friendlier. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The game started out with him taking the ball from me and scoring point after point. I was smaller than him, so it was easy for him to steal the ball from me and rack up points while I stumbled around. After a while, I started developing some strategies to get around him, though, and I started making some points on my own. Before I knew it, we were nearly tied, and this was unacceptable to Tommy. The game had been dirty before, but now it was downright brutal. The first time he pushed me, I heard Blue growl a warning. The second time he pushed me, I heard Blue snarl at him. On the third time, his fist coming down to crack me on the side of the head, I heard him yell as Blue sank his teeth into Tommy's backside. Tommy cried out, telling me to get my dog off him. I was shocked. I'd never seen Blue bite anyone. He hung onto the back of his jeans, worrying at him, as Tommy ran off the blacktop towards his house. He let him go as his sneakers left the court, and I laughed about it then, Blue grinning his doggy grin as he came back to rub against my hand. When the police arrived at my house later that day, I didn't think it was so funny. They told us that Tommy's parents had reported a dog bite. Specifically, they had reported that Blue had bitten their son, and now the police had come to take him away. I told them my side of the story, all the while clutching Blue around the neck, but it didn't seem to make any difference to them. A dog had bit, and now he had to be put down. I think Dad saw that I was getting really upset, because he agreed to take Blue to the police station and said he wouldn't let them put him to sleep unless I got to say goodbye. This soothed me a little, but I was still pretty upset as I watched my dog walk away for the last time. When Dad came back, it was already nighttime, but he seemed a little happier. He told me that he had come to an understanding with the police officers, and they had let him drop Blue off at Sanders' farm. Dad said that Mr. Sanders usually took in troubled dogs, or dogs that were going to be put down, and let them work on his farm as farm dogs. That way, Blue could live there, and he wouldn't have to be put to sleep. He'll have all kinds of room to run around, much more room than this little apartment, and he'll be happy, Dad had said. I was ecstatic. I was sad that Blue couldn't live with us anymore, but at least the police wouldn't have to put him to sleep. I asked Dad if we could go visit him sometime, to see how he was doing, and Dad said we would see. I went to bed that night and dreamed about Blue as he ran and ran on the farm, herding sheep and running off crows and enjoying his life now that he had a lot of space to play in. I asked Dad a few times if we could go see Blue, but it never seemed to be a good time. Dad always said things like he didn't want to distract him while he was at work, or he didn't want to make it hard for him to settle in by reminding him about his old family. I understood these things. They made sense, but I really wanted to see Blue again. I remember asking a handful of times, but like most kids, my attention span was pretty limited. I got a new game console that year for Christmas. I made the basketball team, so I had to practice almost every day. I was getting ready to go to middle school, so I was a little worried about that. And after a while, I just sort of forgot about Blue. I never really forgot about him. I still thought about him sometimes, in that vague way that kids often do. But I just stopped asking to go see him. Eventually, I guess I stopped thinking about him. Until today, when I saw him on the fence, I hadn't honestly thought about him in years. I was heading to dinner with my parents after work, so I figured I'd let them know what I'd seen. They might like knowing that Blue was okay, and that he was still living a good life. Mom opened the door for me when I knocked, and invited me to help finish fixing dinner. As I chopped vegetables for a salad, I told her what I'd seen, but she didn't seem to understand. The chunk of the knife seemed soothing as it cut the vegetables, and I told her that I'd seen Blue running around the farm where we'd left him. She still seemed a little confused, not really understanding what I was talking about, and when Dad came in, I told him as well. Dad didn't seem confused at all, though. Quite the contrary. He looked a little scared. "You saw Blue at Sanders' farm?" "Yeah, just where you said you dropped him off. He looked really happy. He was running around, chasing birds, and living his best life. He looked up when I drove past and almost seemed to recognize me. I was thinking that I might go visit him, see if he's still—" "Kid," Dad stated, cutting me off, "that's impossible." "I guess you're right," I said, thinking it over as we talked about it. "Blue would have to be 20 years old by now. Maybe it's one of his puppies. It looks just like him. I might stop by anyway, see if maybe Mr. Sanders will sell me one of Blue's puppies. It would be nice to have a reminder of old Blue around the apartment." My dad sat down heavily, and that made me look up at him with real worry. He seemed like he was debating something, or maybe having a hard time accepting something. I was worried for a minute that he might be having a heart attack. He'd had one last year, and after that his heart hadn't exactly been stable. Instead, he just looked up at me like he might have seen a ghost or something. "That's not possible, because Blue is dead." I looked at him in shock. "How do you know? Did Mr. Sanders tell you when he—" "He didn't have to. Blue died the night I took him to the police station. We put him down." My head spun a little. Had they been lying to me this whole time? Dad had told me he'd taken Blue to the farm. He had stuck to that story till eventually I forgot. Had he just been telling me a lie to stop me from being upset? Why had he told me about taking Blue to the farm at all? "Sit down. I think it's time I tell you the truth. It's the truth you may have to face yourself one day, so it's best you hear it now." I sat down, keeping a close eye on my old man, who suddenly seemed less trustworthy than he had a few minutes ago. People in this town always say that they're taking their dogs to the farm. It's been a tradition for at least as long as I can remember. My own dad told me he was taking my dog Scout to Sanders' farm when he got too old and too sick. He said that Scout could run and play for as long as he wanted, and the country air would do him some good. My daddy had never lied to me before, at least not that I knew of, and I was happy that Scout could live somewhere where he could get better. He was old and really sick. I wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to him yet, though. Daddy said we could visit him, but we never did. Eventually, just like you, I kind of forgot about him and went on with my life. I sat in silence, not really sure what to make of all this. So Granddad had lied as well, but this seemed to be a generational lie. Why did so many people use Sanders' farm as a place to leave their dogs? Was it a convenient lie? Or was there more to it? Why did you lie to me?" I asked, still not happy about being misled. "Because I knew that Blue was going to be killed, and I knew that you weren't ready to lose him. Taking him to the farm was just something people tell kids around here. I'd imagine that you have a lot of friends who've had their dogs taken to Sanders' farm over the years. But why? What's the point of it all?" Dad seemed to think about this, weighing his options before settling on, "You'll understand when you're older, when you have kids of your own. Sanders' farm is an important place in this community for many reasons, some of them not quite known even to the people who use it." I didn't end up staying for dinner. I left, despite my mother's protests, and drove home. I don't know why, but I was just so irrationally mad about being lied to. I realized, of course, that my parents had lied like this before. I've lived with the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and even a monster that lived in the basement named Mr. Giles, who would get you if you came downstairs after bedtime. They all turned out to be fake, of course. They were lies they told, but lies that they told gently, and only to add magic to my childhood or keep me from doing foolish things. I could understand those lies, but not this one. This one felt different. This one felt personal. I flopped onto the couch when I got home, and John paused his game as he glanced over at me. "What's wrong, babe? You look upset." "It's nothing," I lied, looking away before finally spilling the whole sad story. I was in tears by the end, my boyfriend holding my hands and patting them gently. He'd grown up here too, and had known my parents only slightly less time than I had. He often gave me some perspective on what was going on, and was my voice of reason in many things. I'm sure your dad had a good reason. He's a good man, and I don't feel like he'd lie to you for no reason. He probably just wanted to protect you. You were 8 after all. He slid his thumbs over the backs of my hands like I liked, and I smiled as I bent forward to kiss his forehead. Thanks, hon. You always know just what to say. John grinned through his beard and reached for the controller again. Boy-friendly duties now complete. Besides, it's not all that weird if you think about it. I cocked an eye at him. What do you mean? Well, that's where my dad took Russell after he got hit by that car. He told me he took him to Mr. Sanders' farm so he could get better, but I guess he never did. That gave me pause. John had basically told me the same story my dad had, and it was a little too similar for coincidence. As John went back to rolling and smashing anything that wandered into his field of vision, I opened my phone and sent a text to my friend Matt. Matt and I had been friends nearly as long as John and I had, and I trusted him as much as I trusted my boyfriend. Hey Matt, just wondering if you've ever heard your parents say anything about taking one of your pets to Sanders' farm. Just curious, trying to settle a bet. The last bit would really hook him. He seemed to like making John look dumb by proving him wrong. I watched John play Elden Ring for a few more minutes before my phone buzzed and I picked it up to see his reply. Wow, that's weird. Yeah, my dad took Snoopy there after he got too old to walk. I haven't thought about that in forever. That's trippy. I thanked him and sent a text to Jane, a friend from work. Jane lived in the next town over, but Kine was still only about 20 minutes from my hometown. I was wondering if this was just a regional thing, or if it extended farther than our little burg. Janet sent back a string of question marks and asked why I needed to know something so weird. I told her it was to settle a bet too, and she told me she'd never had a dog get taken to Sanders' farm. We always just buried them in the backyard, she said. Okay, so maybe it wasn't particularly far-reaching. For the next few hours, as John cursed and growled at the maddening boss he was trying to beat, I sent text after Facebook message after Twitter message and everything in between to old school friends and people I knew from town to ask them if they'd lost dogs too. John's story about Russell had made me realize this was bigger than just my family, and I wanted to know how far exactly. Of the 10 people I got responses from, 6 said their parents had told them they were taking dogs to Sanders' farm. One friend only had cats growing up, and it appeared that they didn't get to live a happy life on Sanders' farm. The other 2 had never been allowed to have pets, so they'd never had anything to lose. The one person whose dog hadn't gone to Sanders' farm had escaped while the family was on vacation, so the whereabouts of the dog were never discovered. The findings were inconclusive, but they were still pretty damn close. Close enough that as John and I climbed into bed that night, I had already decided that I was going to make a stop on my way home from work tomorrow. The plume of dirt that spewed up behind me as I drove up the long driveway to Sanders' farm was the only bell the old farmer seemed to need. He was waiting for me on the porch with a glass of tea, and a weathered old smile spread across his sunburnt face. "Afternoon, kid. What can I do for you?" We shook hands as I introduced myself, and he handed me the glass of tea as I explained why I was there. Mr. Sanders nodded, asking if I'd like to come inside. He didn't seem surprised by the question at all. Quite the contrary. It was as if he'd been waiting for me to come and ask it all this time. I told him that I thought I'd rather sit on the porch and discuss it, and he nodded as he took a seat in one of the old rockers, indicating that I should take the other. Every now and again, someone puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that everyone brings their dogs to Sanders' farm. It's not a new concept. People have been doing it since before the Great Depression. I can't tell you how long it's been going on, but I can tell you how it started if you'd like to hear. I nodded, and he began his story. The first dog to be brought here wasn't really brought at all. His name was Jip, and he was my friend. He was just a pup when I heard him crying one afternoon. He'd gotten himself stuck in a trap, and his pack had deserted him, probably thinking he was done for. He was just a little half-starved thing, but he growled at me as I came to get him loose. Turned out I didn't have to do too much. The trap had nearly tore his front paw off, and he was bleeding out. It seemed a shame to let him die, so I held him down and tied his foot off with a handkerchief. He struggled a lot, snapping and snarling as I tried to stop the bleeding, but eventually he quieted down as the blood oozed out of him and he became less coherent. I scooped him up and took him back home, cutting the little bit of skin off that held his paw on and dressing it as best I could. I was afraid he had died for a little while, but when I heard him come to, snarling and snuffling and howling, I knew he'd likely recover. He smiled as he remembered it, likely thinking of the little wolf pup as he tried to act twice his size. We started off slow, but eventually I earned his trust. His paw would never grow back, but he managed to teach himself to walk with 3 legs. I had done a good enough job of cleaning it up that it didn't get infected, and after a few months the lack of a paw didn't seem to slow him down. He couldn't return to his pack. I'm not sure he ever even tried, but he was my dog after that, and I loved him. His smile became sad, and I felt we were about to come to the part of the story where he lost that friend. We lived together for about 12 years, both of us growing old as the seasons passed. Jip's gait was slower, and his joints creaked when he walked, but he was still always willing to walk around with me when I did my work. I was in my late 40s, working the land as I do now, when we stumbled upon a bear one day. He had decided to bed down in my corn crib, and when I went down to check my stores, he woke up and charged me. Jip got between us. He was never far from my side, and gave me time to get my rifle. I put the bear down as the 3-legged wolf kept him from attacking me, but the damage was done. Jip had been slashed a dozen times, and I sat with him as he lay bleeding on the dirt floor of my storehouse. Mr. Sanders got a far-off look as he watched the sun sink, seeing far-off days as the sun set over his crops. I buried him in the field, the place he loved the most. I'd built him a house, put him a ratty blanket on the porch, but he seemed to love sleeping amongst the swaying corn plants and amidst the dirt of the field. I buried him there, thinking he might nourish the crops as his spirit lay content, but I never could have foreseen what would happen. That night, I heard a loud barking, a barking that sounded like Jip's. I rushed out with my rifle and found him smiling and barking at the edge of the field, good as new. Behind him, though, the crops had grown 4 times as plentiful. Corn and beans and squash and potatoes, everything else I grew in those days, too. Jip looked at me as though to say, "Thanks for a good life," and then he dove back into the field, and I never saw him again. That was how it started. "Well, what started?" I asked, feeling my skin prickle. "The crops came in, and I brought my wares to the nearest market. I made enough money to build a new barn, buy a new horse, and eat like a king that winter. There had been enough food to stuff my storehouse, and the excess I'd taken to market was more like a normal yield from any other year. The next year I planted as I had every year, and old Jip brought in another bountiful harvest. I bought more land, made plans to plant an orchard, began to think about buying cattle and sheep. I even thought about becoming some kind of land baron in this underdeveloped part of the country. The next 2 years were just as fine, but I was in for a surprise." He coughed a little and asked me if I'd get him a glass of tea from the kitchen. I obliged, moving into the house and taking a glass from the cabinet as I moved to the battered old fridge. I refilled my own as I poured the cold tea into the new glass. I was suddenly very thirsty, and my throat felt dry as a bone. When I brought it back to him, he thanked me before taking a long sip. After 4 years of amazing yield, the 5th year was a disappointment. The crops did well as they ever did before Jip died, but the bounty was nowhere to be seen. I had just begun planting the fruit trees, and just started making inquiries about livestock. I worried that I wouldn't be able to afford any of the plans I'd been making, and that temporary success might just slip through my fingers. The next year was much the same, but I had noticed a small decline in the quality of my produce. There had been no blight, no insects to speak of, but the crops seemed weaker, more feeble this year. I began to panic. What would I do if the field stopped making? What could I do if the vegetables stopped coming? I tried different things that spring to rejuvenate the fields. I bought tonics from a traveling man. I put down fertilizer. I tried increasing the water I gave the fields. The fertilizer, however, had made me remember that I had used something very different to fertilize the land 4 years ago, and that made me wonder if doing so might rejuvenate the fields again. The sun was sinking lower now, the fiery ring just over the tops of the corn as they waved merrily. And so I set out to find a proper sacrifice for the land, something to bring it back again. I tried forest animals. Jip had been of the forest after all, but to no avail. I tried strays from the nearby town, but they did nothing. In my desperation, I'm ashamed to say that I bought and killed animals from the local stableman, even going so far as to buy and slaughter a horse, but they did little to rejuvenate the crop. Then one evening, as I came back from the market with my pathetic yield, I nearly struck a child as he came bounding into the road. The dog with him, just an average mutt, pushed him out of the way, and my tires crunched over the animal. I heard the boy cry out in despair as he cradled the dying dog in his arms. Its back was clearly broken, but I wasted no time. I took the dog with me, driving away quickly as the father came rushing out to see what all the fuss was about. The setting sun cut fire lines across his eyes, and the sting must have been uncomfortable, if not eye-watering. Mr. Sanders seemed not to notice, though. He was dead by the time I arrived home, and I buried him in the field, as I had with Jip. The crops came back, the land thrived, and I think that was when I realized what the land wanted. The old dog had been loved, just as Jip had been loved, and that love seemed to nourish the land like nothing else. From that day on, I seemed to always have my eyes peeled for dogs. The sick ones could sometimes be taken off the owner's hands, but I had been known to buy them from struggling families as well. As the years went by and the town grew, so too did my prosperity. I was one of the largest farmers in the region. My produce sold at every general store and market for miles around. I've seen the horses replaced by automobiles, seen the carts that came to get my food replaced by trucks, and all the while, my fields continue to put out more of the stuff I needed to grow. Ah, but there was a price, and the price has become quite steep over the years. I was still mulling over what he had said, and when he paused to drain the dregs of his glass, I asked the question that had been wavering on the edge of my mind. Mr. Sanders, how old are you? Mr. Sanders fixed me with a mischievous grin, and it took years off of him. Just starting to put it together, eh? I was born in 1815. I bought this land in 1845. The year I buried Jip, I was 45, and I have stayed that age ever since. Despite having more crops than I know what to do with, the land also grants me life for my sacrifice. I can't explain why, and I can't explain how, but I keep living as long as the land thrives. I wanted to deny what he was saying, but I could find no argument against it. The man looked old, sun-weathered, but not ancient. How would he manage to keep from being noticed? If he had really owned this farm for so long, how had no one seen? As my farm grew, so too did the town. The market thrived, the people prospered, and thus began the agreement. I had grown tired of finding my own sacrifices, so I made them a deal. They would bring me their dogs, those who were sick or those who were too old to carry on, and I would continue to make the town flourish. By that time, I was making a sacrifice once a month. Today, I make a sacrifice once a day. Before too long, I fear that it will become unmanageable, and the farm will fail. I said nothing, just sitting and staring, wishing I could believe that this man was crazy. I suppose that wouldn't be too bad. I've grown tired of living and making sacrifices, and maybe it's finally time to rest. Nothing lasts forever, after all, not even immortality, he said, grinning. The grin made his face look skeletal, his true age shining through at last. I thanked him for the tea, thanked him for the story, and stood up shakily. Take care of yourself, kid, and don't worry.
Old Blue is as happy as any other dog here. You did what you could for him, and now he's at rest where no one can hurt him ever again." I nodded dumbly, my legs shivering as I walked down the stairs to my car. As I climbed in, I thought I saw a familiar brown snout as it poked from the rows of corn plants. My hands froze halfway to the ignition. He was grinning at me, looking out through the corn and panting happily. It was as if he had come back one last time to say goodbye, and as we locked eyes, he slid slowly back into the field. I've driven by that farm once a day since, but I've never seen Blue again. I do worry, though, about what will happen to all those ghosts if something should happen to Sanders' farm. The crops have begun to look a little different lately, less healthy, more like plants that are rotting from the inside. If the vegetables die, if the farm fails, then what will happen to all those spirits that call the land their home? There was a sign next to the dirt road today that said, "For sale by owner." I suppose soon we may very well find out.
Well, everyone, I think that'll just about do it for today. But don't be sad. I'm sure we'll be back again next time with more wonderful stories and more time spent indoors around a fire, cozy together. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.